my pleasure to introduce Dr. Justin Brown. Dr. Brown is an assistant teaching professor at Iowa State University in BD-PAM, as well as a professor within the Swine Medicine Education Center within Iowa State. Dr. Brown earned his DVM in 2016 from the University of Georgia and joined the Iowa State faculty in 2019. Today, Dr. Brown will be presenting on a practical approach to early intervention to reduce sow mortality.
All right. Y'all hear me okay? That sound good? Perfect. All right, so thanks for coming today. So thanks for that introduction, Spencer. Appreciate that. So yeah, going to talk about this practical approach to early intervention to try and help you reduce sow mortality, right? So trying to keep it simple. And this is part, this study was funded by this survivability grant that Dr. Ross received, this multi-million-dollar grant here. So without the support of this grant, this project wouldn't have been able to be accomplished. So, but where it all kind of stemmed from is looking at sow mortality through the years, right? So this graph shows you from 2004 up until recently in 2020. So looking at PigChamp data across about 350 farms and almost 700,000 sows, we've seen a steady increase in mortality, right? A lot of you are probably dealing with this in your farms, right? Having a lot more mortality within your farms, upwards on average of 14%. Some farms individually might even have higher than that. So a few years ago, a student did a small project, small pilot study looking at weekly sow death in a 2,600 head sow farm that to try to see over this 7-week project if identifying at-risk sows and aggressively treating those could they have an impact on sow mortality. So again, this project lasted for 7 weeks. So from week 19 till week 24 was the pre-study period where they just tracked mortality, right? Pulled that from the record. So you had somewhere between 4 and 8 per week mortality there. And then here at week 24, they started really aggressively treating those sows, okay? And saw a drastic decrease in those mortalities that remained low out through week 30, right? So appropriately treating them, early identifying them seemed to have an impact. So what we wanted to do was take this study and replicate it, again, on a couple different types of sow farms. And so our objectives then were, could we see that same reduction in sow mortality by increasing our emphasis on identifying and treating disadvantaged sows? So really, like Dr. Friendship likes to mention the simple things, right? Keep it simple, the KISS method. Right? So identifying sows early, be that whether they're off feed, they're lame, treating them early and aggressively to try to keep them in the herd. We also wanted to understand what the time requirement is to do this, right? You all probably have labor issues on your farm, I would guess, right? Finding people and the time to do all those other tasks on farm, so feeding, breeding, cleaning, weaning, everything else you have to do on farm, and now we're going to ask you to come in and spend more time treating and identifying those sows. So what would that investment look like for you? And then can this protocol be transferred to farm staff and continue to maintain that mortality reduction, right? So that it's not a vet or a senior production manager or somebody upper level in your system. Can you give it to the farm level staff that they can take and implement this? So where we started was a 4,000 head sow farm here in central Iowa. They had 3 breeding and gestation buildings where they were all stalled. So this is a purely stalled farm. We'll talk about pen gestation later on in this presentation. We did not do any evaluation in farrowing. We were only looking at impacts we could make in the gestation barns, right? So at this farm, we've got 3 gestation barns. This farm was PRRS and MHP positive as well. They had the mash feed that, like most of you are probably familiar with, in these drop boxes, and they were fed once per day in the morning. When we started this study, they were at 17% sow mortality. Okay, so a little bit higher than that average I showed you on the first graph. And we did this training a little over a year ago now, in June of 21, through the 7th through the 18th of 21. So this is just summary of data from that farm looking at the reasons for sow mortality. So from January to October of that year, 30% were POPs, pelvic organ prolapses, right? Another third, 34% were lameness and downers, and then about a quarter were sudden deaths. So by not looking at farrowing, we're probably not going to impact the pelvic organ prolapses at this level, right? Most of that's going to occur in our farrowing houses. You might see some of them out in gestation, but a majority is going to occur in farrowing. So probably not going to impact there. But what we could impact potentially were these lameness and sudden deaths that were marked as reasons for the mortalities in that farm. So this is just a record of the treatment protocol that the farm would use. So if the animals were all feed or lame, these are just the treatments they would get, right? Just to show you an example of what the farm might use. Again, I'm not telling you this is the best method or the best protocol to use, just an example of what they did. So for all feed, if they had a fever, they'd get flunixin and Oxytet. If they didn't have a fever, would just get flunixin. And as a secondary option, they have over here. If they were lame and had a fever, Linco and Banamine or flunixin, and no fever, flunixin and Banamine flunixin and Linco as well. So, how do you do it? What's the process? How do you go through it? So, when we did this for the study, there was an ISU vet, so myself or Dr. Rademacher or Dr. Locke-Carricker would be on site, and then along with one of the gestation barn staff. Typically, that's one of the gestation barn managers that would go through with us, and we would just walk the B&G barns as sows were being fed. So these sows got fed once every morning, right? So we would pair up, walk in the farm, they'd drop feed, and we would just start walking. One of us in front of the stall, one of us behind the stall. So as you can kind of see in this picture here, one farm staff behind. This is one of our postdocs, Meredith Peterson, walking down the alley in front. So that's one thing we learned. Having somebody in front and behind really helps you with getting the animals up that are down already, right? They can be kind of stubborn to get up sometimes just by walking the alley. But also, hard to see the back legs if you're standing in front of the stall, right? So having somebody behind, you can pick up on, is it a hind limb lameness, is there a swollen hock, things like that. So having somebody in the front and the back is pretty important. Any females that weren't eating or up at the feeder were flagged by hanging a card, just a treatment card or some way to flag that animal so we could come back later and do a more thorough assessment of her. And then our goal was to finish identifying those sows before they lay down post-eating, right? Because what's the sow going to do in her stall? You're going to drop feed, she's going to get up to eat, and then she wants to just lay down and rest, right? She's pregnant, kind of tired from standing on her feet at that point, she just wants to lay back down. So you got to be pretty deliberate with going through, which is why we would just flag them to come back later, get her up again to do a more thorough evaluation. So our goal was about 30 minutes per barn or room to get through. This, hopefully it plays. Whoops. Just a video showing, maybe. Maybe not. It's not going to play on here. The codec's not there. That's okay. This was just going to be a video showing, you can see this sow that's laying down. Everybody's up around her and eating, right? So you got one of the barn managers walking here along the row between the stalls, and then Dr. Peterson out in front. And so they're going to try to get her up, flag her, and do a more thorough evaluation of her later on in the visit. This video, again, it won't play, but it would have shown you an example of toe tapping, right? So most of you are probably familiar with that. Animal gets up, and then they just kind of dance around on both feet. She can't get comfortable, doesn't want to put all of her weight on both of those hind limbs, and so we would treat her for lameness at that point, and apologize for those videos not being able to play today. So this picture, hopefully you can pick out, you got 3 sows here on this left side. She's completely cleaned up her meal, so has this sow, but she still has feed remaining, right? And she's already laying down compared to her cohorts on either side of her. So she's one we want to further evaluate, right? Because animals, kind of like us, you don't feel good, don't want to get up and eat, right? So first sign that something's kind of off with her. So we would flag her, hang a card there on the front of her crate or on the line over her crate to come back and evaluate her at a later time. So when to do that follow-up examination and treatment, really when it works best for your staff, right? All you're trying to do there at the beginning is flag them, right? Something's wrong with this girl. We need to take a more in-depth look at her to see what's going on, what we can evaluate. So we allowed the staff to decide when to come back and assess that sow and assign the treatment. We didn't change treatment protocols or influence those in any ways. We just had them follow farm protocols like I showed you a few slides ago. And then some farms might treat during identifications while they might do it later in the day. It's really just according to the farm SOP, when it works for them to come back and treat. So the main things that we saw were sows that were off feed. That was our primary clinical sign that keyed us that something was off on her. About a third of those that we enrolled in the study had 2 symptoms, most of those, again, being off feed and lame, okay? Which if you think back to our reasons for mortality that we showed, lameness was one of the top 3 reasons there. So having her be off feed too, if she's lame, she probably doesn't want to get up, right? And so if she doesn't want to get up, then she's not going to eat, and so you kind of can connect those 2 there. But a vast majority were off feed, is why we flagged them to look at them a little bit further. Gilts were the primary parity that we identified as at risk. About a third of those that we enrolled were gilts. This isn't adjusted for parity distribution in the farm, but gilts were our primary risk within the study, at least from what we found in this one farm. So what we wanted to do too to try to get a little more out of this study and see if we could identify sows or find things that we might can detect on sows was a case control study to say, hey, if we look at her blood levels, so her complete blood count of different cells, the serum chemistry, and a urinalysis, could we measure something on those sows that might be a predictor of her outcome on the farm, right? If she had low glucose for whatever reason, was that a positive or negative predictor of her staying in the farm? So for each case that we found, so a sow that was off feed or lame or both, whatever enrolled her in the study, we would find a parity matched control within the same breed group, right? So she's at the same stage of production, same parity, and we would enroll her, collect a blood sample and a urinalysis. So we were about 55% successful within 30 minutes of placing this urine collection device, which is just a tampon. So that can make guys kind of comfortable, right? We have to learn a new skill. But it did me. I'm right there with you guys. But one of our interns back in 2016, Dr. Megan Nickel, who's now with Holden Farms, came up with this method. So you just insert a tampon into the sow and tape that to the side. When she urinates, it expels the tampon. You come back by, pick it up, wring it out, you got your urine sample and can look at it there. So pretty quick. The main issue is sometimes the tape won't hold completely well and they'll fall off. Or if the sow urinates and you're not there to collect it, she'll lay down and sit on it and squash it and you lose your sample. But we got about half the sows that we wanted to collect that way. So, like I said, we looked at the ClinPath results from these, comparing those cases and controls by pairs, and looked at the values within normal ranges as categorical variables. So were they normal, below, or above normal, just to see if there was any differences. And then some of these, we looked at comparison of continuous numerical values as well. But started off by just doing it categorical, was there a difference, and then numerical. Unfortunately, most of the comparisons weren't significantly different, okay? Didn't really tell us a lot. Not anything we can put our finger on that says, hey, this is what you need to be measuring to understand if this sow is going to remain in your herd or not. But I'll show you a few that were a little bit different and kind of interesting based off values. So serum calcium was a little bit lower in the cases versus controls. So normal is 8 to 12. You can see both of these ranges are within the normal range though, and that's only 0.3 difference, but overall cases were a little lower. Not really sure what that means. We also didn't test urine for calcium and phosphorus, so we might have seen a difference there that we didn't see in the serum, because the body's always buffering that calcium level in the serum, right? So it should stay pretty constant in the serum. Serum glucose. This one was kind of interesting to me. Normal values in swine, somewhere between 65 to 150, very similar to people. So near and dear to my heart because I'm a type 1 diabetic, so I can relate to this. Cases were typically lower. I think that makes sense if you think about it, right? Because what was the majority of our cases? All feed, right? So if they aren't eating, sure, they're going to have a lower blood glucose at that point, right? So, but what was really interesting too was our controls who did eat, they still, I would call that low normal, right? 70 on average milligrams per deciliter within an hour of feeding when we collected that sample, right? So if you think about a normal blood glucose curve, we should get that spike between 1 to 2 hours post-feeding. So really, what are these? I think it'd be interesting to go and look pre-feeding, what are sows running at a normal fasting rate? So are we running them too low potentially? Serum AST is just a non-specific indicator of liver damage if it's elevated. Again, these are both within the normal range, but our cases were a little bit higher. So you can see some elevated AST with inflammation and stuff too, so maybe our cases have a little bit more inflammation there. Total bilirubin, again, looking at liver function or hemolysis, red blood cell destruction. Our cases were higher there. This one was slightly significant based off the p-value, but 0 to 1, still within our normal range, right? So really, physiologically, what does it mean? We see it elevated in reduced hepatic function secondary to heart failure or biliary obstruction. Mycoplasma suis infection could cause it, right? Because you can lyse red blood cells with Mycoplasma suis, or just by blood collection, right? But if it was iatrogenic, we probably would have expected to see an increase in our controls too, right? Because it was typically the same person bleeding each day we collected samples. Serum fibrinogen, a level that we can look at for inflammation. So our cases are a little bit higher, again, in the normal range, but still typically a little bit higher. That probably makes sense, right? Our cases probably have some sort of inflammation going on that we would expect them to have a little bit higher serum fibrinogen compared to our controls. Although probably would have expected it to be even higher, maybe outside the normal range, but both of these, the cases and controls, were within the normal range there. Urine pH we did look at. This one was significant. Our cases were typically lower than our controls by about 3/4 of a point there. Non-specific and can be impacted by feed and water consumption. Not near as much data on the impact of feed and urine pH in swine as there is in dairy cattle, right? But for those of you familiar with dairy cattle, we feed DCAD diets that impact urine pH so that we can impact ketone production, right? So raises the question, is what we're feeding our sows impacting their urine pH? And with them being off feed, or is their body now normalizing or changing that urine pH because they've been off feed for a certain period of time, right? So again, those are some things we looked at, just some interesting comparisons. Again, nothing was really the smoking gun to say, hey, go out and bleed your sows, whatever this value tells you. It's a predictor of whether she's going to remain in the herd for a longer period of time or not, unfortunately. But just some interesting comparisons there. So this is where the study really gets interesting, though. So remember we went in, we started flagging animals, treating them more aggressively, early detection. And so what you see on your graph here is the group or the weeks across the bottom, and then our percent mortality. So mortality is kind of creeping along here around 15% or so. This red arrow is where we implemented the training. And then post this is our impact, right? Or what we can attribute some of our training to for mortality. So we went from about 16.75% down to about 12.5% mortality on this farm. So about 4.2% reduction in annualized sow mortality on this farm. And running a chi-squared test on that is pretty significant based off that p-value of 0.007. So we had the 23 weeks of data before and then 23 weeks of data after we implemented the training, and we were only on farm for 2 weeks. And when I say we, that'd be one of the ISU vets. And so we were on farm each day for 2 weeks to help identify, flag those, train the farm staff, and then we stepped away and said, hey, can they take this to answer that question? Can they take this and run with it? And it looks like they could, right? Maintain that down there. And so made a pretty good impact there. So what is 4.25% reduction worth? What does it mean? So as another part of this livability, survivability grant, some others here at ISU are working on this economic opportunity model. So we plugged in numbers from this farm, and based off of opportunity costs of losing pregnant females, additional cull sow income, having to bring in fewer replacement females because of your increased mortality, we get about $50 per sow. And if you work that out over wean pigs, you get about $2 per wean pig savings for this farm, right? So for the model, you would need to take your farm and put in your data, right? What's your herd rollover, your production costs, and things like that. But for this farm, this is where we could get. So pretty substantial impact, I would say, on this farm. For the time commitment, right? Like we heard this morning, time's your biggest commodity, right? And you got to have people to do the job to do this. So for our time commitment, on average, we said about 2 hours per day for at-risk identification for 2 people. And that can be done while walking the barn, sweeping, dropping feed, doing your barn checks. It's going to vary based on herd size though, right? Smaller farm, you can get through quicker. Larger farm, it's going to take longer to get through, right? Kind of makes sense. Common sense. But about 1 hour per day, additionally for follow-up treatments. If you can assign one person to do that, that would help with treatment consistency, right? Because as you all know, protocols are only as good as the people that follow them, right? So we can have protocols all day, but if I have worker A and worker B, and they decide that for the off-feed and lame sow, I'm going to treat with these 2, and then I'm going to treat with these 2, you're going to get potentially different results, right? So trying to get that down to one person to do the actual treatments to minimize that treatment variation probably comes out to around an additional half full-time equivalent person that you need on farm, an additional half of a person, right? And so your question for me is, well, where am I going to find that? I don't know. I hope you can, right? But I understand that there's labor shortages, labor issues, and time commitments already on farm. But this will be about what you would need to invest in a person to be able to accomplish this on your farms. So this system that we were working with, they really liked the results from the one farm. So around week 33, 34, they started rolling it out in other farms in their systems with 2-man teams. And so as a system basis, they were running around 19%, 20% or so, and we're able to make a pretty drastic increase across about 40 farms there, right, by implementing this early identification and treatment of at-risk sows on farm to try to decrease sow mortality. So that was all stall gestation, right? And so now our question is, can we replicate this across barn types, right? A lot of you probably represent multiple barn types in this room. And so we took this to a pen gestation farm within the same system, 4,200 head. They use stalls for breeding out to about 55 days of gestation, then mix those into the stalls, and then pens until farrowing. So we just did this back in May. I don't have any data to show you for the mortality reduction yet. We're still waiting to get our data set on the back end. But we were training farms and senior style service staff. Some of you are in the room that helped with this and went through it, and we really appreciate the collaboration there. So some tips and tricks, though, for group house gestation. So it took a little bit longer to get through, right? So the farm was a little bit bigger, 3 hours for 3 to 4 man teams. We had 4 buildings, plus we had some training of other personnel going on as we went through. So that one took a little bit longer for us. And still, what we got down to, 2-man teams are key. When you're in pen gestation, I think 3-man teams are helpful. So you could have one person on either side of the outside of the pens, and then one person walk in the middle, especially if you got human holes to get through, man gates to jump through in the middle. Can really help you speed up and flag and identify. So, because you can't flag like you can in stalls, right? We can't just hang a card on her. So we would take livestock paint and mark her near her head to come back and identify her, look at her a little bit closer. So more vulva biting in pens, particularly in tighter stocking density there. I think you all are probably familiar with that. Our gilt treatments, they were all feed during the stall acclimation period, and they had MHP positive farm here, so we saw more gilt treatments going on. It's really difficult to interpret all feed during post-weaning and around breeding, right? A lot of y'all probably are familiar with how sows act, their behavior around those times, right? Sometimes they just don't feel great. They don't want to eat, right? They're in standing heat. They just want to stand up, or they don't want to stand for you. So just by going off feed, they might catch your eye, right, as you go through and say, oh, she's not eating. Let's take a closer look. But that doesn't mean that she always needs some sort of treatment, right? So if she's just off feed, especially if she's in one of these groups, post-weaning or breeding groups, might just need to let her kind of chill out for a couple days, put her on a checklist to reevaluate each day, and then maybe implement some sort of treatment.
So was this a drop feed system or an electronic feeding system?
So it was an electronic feeding system, but they could control when they dropped it. So it was the same way we went in and dropped feed. So, but it wasn't like an ESF feed, if that makes sense, right? So difficult to interpret post-mixing breed groups too, right? So they went to about 55 days in stalls, and then they would mix. And what do sows do when you mix them? They fight, right? They establish that hierarchy. And so is she truly lame due to some sort of infectious issue that's going on, or did she just kind of get bullied around when she got mixed into that group? So evaluating them then. And then gilts and sows that are difficult to get up. I think a lot of us think, and I'm guilty of this too, that sows that are difficult to get up, especially when they're in a stall, that they're just stubborn, right? They're just tired, don't want to get up. And really, that's probably not the case. They don't want to get up, probably, more likely, because something's painful for them when they do that, right? They've got to put a lot of pressure on those front limbs to get up, right? And stand up as they push themselves up. So, especially if they'll like kind of get their back legs up underneath them, but then they don't want to get up the rest of the way. They might have some front limb lameness going on, which is typically harder to appreciate for us, right? Because it gets up into that elbow or even into the shoulder, and we might not be able to see that. So just some things we learned on that farm. So we've really forgotten about the importance of early detection and individual sow treatments, particularly in breeding and gestation. So by the time we treat them, it might be too late, right? By the time that we see her down, she's been down for a couple of days, we notice the feed in front of her. We really need to be doing this every single day. So individual sow care, really like individual pig care, right? That you've all probably been taught or familiar with. So treat them as A pigs, not as C pigs. So if we treat them as an A sow, more likely to have an impact, hopefully keep her in the herd, reduce that mortality. And it's pretty easily implementable. Just flag them off feed, sows while feeding, sweep it in the AM whenever it works for them, then come back and treat later when that's appropriate, right? If you can find the personnel and capacity to do that. But hopefully I've shown you today this has made a pretty good impact. This study wouldn't have been possible without the people on this list. So Dr. Rademacher, Dr. Carricker, Megan Nickel, Meredith Peterson, Gabby Don, all part of the Swine Medicine Education Center, along with Kristen Skolin, Swami, Dr. Linares, Dr. Silva, with the ISU Field Epi Group, Iowa Select, and Dr. Mora, and Dr. Pete Thomas have really been great collaborators on this project. So with that, you can scan that QR code. That'll put my contact information in your phone. If you ever have questions or want to chat about it, I'm happy to do so, or set a meeting with me and Chris, Dr. Rademacher. I'm happy to do that and happy to answer any questions. Hopefully I kept us on time. So.
Any questions for Dr. Brown?
Be interested to know with your sow reduction death loss of 4%, were you finding effective treatments for those sows that were out feeding or laying, or did the culling percentage go up on those sows where they culled earlier, and did that affect the trade-off of the death loss?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was, did we see a treatment effect, that the treatments we were doing, were they efficacious? Or did we see them get cold earlier, and did that affect death loss? So we didn't look at treatment outcome, right? We just followed them through treatment. And then I'd have to double check, but I'm pretty sure culls were counted in as the mortality, right? So was that right, Noel? Or?
No, but the retention would have gone up.
Yeah, yeah,
Retention would have gone up.
yeah. So, yeah.
You had collected a lot of data that was basically the same between treatment, normal and treated animals. Did you attempt to look at multivariate analysis and see if you actually get a picture of what the sick animal looked like there? Because everything was in one direction. You know, they're numerically different, not all of that statistical. But can you look at that based upon why you treated it and the multivariate analysis to get a picture, a cluster?
So we didn't look at that, but potentially we could go back and look at it that way. We didn't and haven't gone that because all of those ranges that I showed you are still within normal, what we say is normal values for the animals, right? So unless we do a larger study to redefine what normal values are, and those might be different now, honestly, if I'm speaking bluntly, right? Because those normal values were calculated with a different type of pig years ago, right? So that might be a little bit different, but yeah.
But it really looks like you have some good data there that from multivariate analysis you should be able to pick something up.
Sure.
Because all of them are different. It looks like to me, it's just, you don't have the numbers.
Yep, yep. And we just did a subset, right, of 30 head case control, so really 15, right? So. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, Tom.
Hi, Justin. Hey, was there differences in the number of treatments, or can you share that with the group, how much more treatment you had given the high level of surveillance that you were able to implement? So,
Sure, yeah.
did you triple them?
Yeah, I don't have that number offhand, but treatments definitely went up in the farms, but I don't have by what percentage we increased treatments in the farm. But treatments definitely went up in the farm for sure. And that might be something we could talk with the system about to try to pull that information.
Would that be valuable?
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
What was the process verification that the managers did to actually make sure it was being executed at the rate you guys preferred?
Yeah, so we, Dr. Chris Rademacher, we would go back and kind of spot check with the farm, right? So we were just there for the 2 weeks on site and trained them on going through and identifying. And then we would go back and go through the barn with them or after them. They had already gone through. We'd come at a later time that day and say, hey, would we have flagged somebody that you didn't at that point? And so we spot checked a few times post that, and then it seemed like we were within 95% or greater on who we would identify, and we left them alone at that point. So.
The system actually expanded across to numerous farms, correct?
Yep.
Well, then how was that
So I'm not exactly sure exactly how they went about implementing it with their production staff and putting that in the farms. I mean, if one of y'all wants to speak up and talk to that, you can. But I'm not sure. I don't think they did exactly what we did, spending 2 weeks in the farm with them, right? So, good question though.
Thank you.
Yep.
Justin, I have a question. So you mentioned that you improved retention. Did you look at longevity, particularly of P0s or P1s
We
going
have
into
not
farm?
gone back and looked at that, but yeah.
Any further questions for Dr. Brown? All right, let's go ahead and thank our speaker.